Imagine moving from a massive, sprawling metropolis, like, say, London, to this beautiful tropical island. You're expecting a change of pace, a better lifestyle, and then you open your first utility bill.
Oh, yeah, that sinking feeling.
Right. And you discover your electricity costs haven't just gone up a little bit, they've become some of the highest in the entire world.
Which is completely wild when you actually think about it.
It is. You're staring at the paper, trying to make the math work, wondering, how powering a single home on an island could possibly cost more than running an apartment in one of the most expensive cities on Earth.
And that piece of paper, it represents a lot more than just the kilowatt hours used to keep your fridge running.
Exactly. Today, we are looking at a recent 7% price hike that is doing a lot more than just annoying consumers. It is exposing a massive global infrastructure trap.
It really forces us to look under the hood of how nations actually power themselves. Because that bill, it's basically a physical receipt for systemic vulnerability.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are pulling from a really fascinating source to guide this conversation. It's a new Substack piece just published yesterday, March 31st, 2026, by Dean Jones and Jamaica Homes.
Yeah, it's a great piece.
It's titled Power, Price, and the Cost of Living in the Dark.
Which is such a striking title. It captures the dual nature of the problem perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the literal cost of power outages, obviously, but also the figurative cost.
The costs of the public being kept in the dark.
Exactly. Being kept in the dark about the structural flaws they are financing every single month.
Our mission for this deep dive is to explore how that seemingly straightforward 7% spike in electricity prices in Jamaica actually serves as a masterclass in how centralized energy models can financially trap consumers anywhere.
Anywhere in the world, yeah.
We're unpacking the vulnerability to global shocks and looking at who really holds the risk in a nation's infrastructure.
Okay, let's unpack this because, on the surface, a 7% increase might just sound like standard annoying inflation.
Right, just another price bump. But the source material makes it incredibly clear that the underlying mechanics of this price hike are, well, they're far from normal.
They really are. To understand the mechanics, we have to look at the immediate trigger for the bill shock. The article notes that electricity bills in Jamaica recently rose by about 7% compared to usage back in November 2025.
But it wasn't a rate hike, right?
Exactly. Crucially, this was not a change in the base tariff. The utility company did not raise the fundamental price of the service they provide. The base rate actually remained entirely static.
So if the company didn't raise their actual service price, that 7% had to come from somewhere else.
Right.
The source points to external factors, specifically higher global fuel costs and the disruptive aftermath of recent hurricanes.
Which brings us to a systemic design that dictates the utility sector in many parts of the world, but is hyper-pronounced in Jamaica. And that is the pass-through model.
The pass-through model.
Yeah. In a pass-through model, the utility provider acts as a conduit rather than a buffer. They do not absorb the financial impact of external variables.
Let's break down how this works mechanically for you, the listener, because understanding this pass-through model is basically the skeleton key to this entire situation.
It really is.
So the utility company is relying heavily on imported fuel to run their generation plants. When global oil prices surge, maybe due to a geopolitical conflict thousands of miles away, the utility company doesn't take a hit to their profit margins.
Nope, not at all.
They simply calculate the extra cost of that oil and pass it directly through to your monthly bill.
And the same logic applies to weather events. Say a hurricane hits and severely disrupts the supply chain, right? Making the logistics of acquiring and transporting that fuel more expensive.
That logistical premium is just passed through to the consumer.
Exactly. Or if the local currency weakens against the US dollar, making those same fuel imports drastically more expensive overnight, the consumer absorbs the currency depreciation.
It's crazy. And the source notes it goes even deeper than global commodities or currency markets. It bleeds into local operational failures, too.
Yeah, the system losses.
Right, even system losses, meaning technical inefficiencies in the grid itself or literal electricity theft where individuals are illegally tapping into the network.
And a portion of the financial burden for that stolen or lost power finds its way back to the paying customers.
Imagine you're renting an apartment, right? And your landlord suddenly hikes your rent because someone stole a completely different tenant's TV.
Wow. Yeah.
Or because the landlord's own roof is old and drafty. It's wild.
What's fascinating here is how this creates a perfect environment for risk concentration.
Risk concentration?
Yeah. Think of utility grids not just as wires and transformers, but as complex financial instruments. In this specific instrument, the utility company has effectively privatized the profits while successfully socializing the risks.
Socializing the risks. So the public pays for everything that goes wrong.
Precisely. The system isn't malfunctioning. It is functioning exactly as it was designed to. The design itself dictates that the public must act as an infinite financial shock absorber for every vulnerability in the supply chain.
That reframes the entire relationship. I mean, you are doing everything right on a personal level. You're buying energy-efficient appliances. You're turning off the AC when you leave the house.
Doing all the right things.
But your bill still skyrockets because you are fundamentally underwriting the losses of a system you don't control. I want to quote the article directly here. A country cannot build a future on a system where the people carry all the risk and none of the control.
That's a powerful line. Because it creates a scenario where inefficiency is quite literally priced into daily life.
Right.
From an economic theory perspective, the pass-through model ensures the utility company remains solvent, which, is necessary to keep the power flowing.
Sure, we need the power to stay on.
But on a human level, it forces the population to constantly bail out systemic failures without giving them any equity or agency in the system itself.
Okay, but if the consumer is permanently trapped, carrying the financial risk of these storms and global supply chain hiccups, why is the physical grid still so incredibly vulnerable to them in the first place?
That's the big question.
I mean, where is the incentive to actually upgrade the infrastructure if the utility company never has to pay the penalty for its fragility?
You've hit on the core structural flaw right there. Moving from the financial ledger to the physical infrastructure. The source details that Jamaica's electricity grid relies on the traditional centralized hub-and-spoke model.
The classic setup.
Right. Large generation plants push power through massive transmission lines to substations, which then feed individual homes.
Wait, centralized grids are the standard global structure. Almost everyone uses them. Why is this specifically such a liability here, and why does the source call resilience an illusion?
This raises an important question about context. A centralized grid benefits from economies of scale in massive, geographically stable areas. But in a small island nation, entirely reliant on imported fuels and situated directly in a major hurricane corridor, the margin for failure shrinks to almost zero.
Because it's a single point of failure.
Exactly. When you rely on a few centralized plants, the main transmission network connecting them is that single point of failure.
A hurricane doesn't just knock out power to a single neighborhood. It has the potential to compromise the transmission lifeblood,
triggering cascading failures that take down massive sections of the country simultaneously.
So nature is acting as a relentless stress test.
Constantly. And the illusion of resilience is a concept the author uses to describe the cycle of destruction and repair. Often, resilience is measured by how fast a utility company can dispatch crews to put the fallen power poles back up after a storm.
Oh, I see. But that is just recovery.
Right.
If you are dispatching a crew to rebuild the exact same fragile transmission line, using the exact same technology, just so it can stand there waiting to be knocked down by the very next storm.
You haven't actually solved the vulnerability.
Exactly. You've just reset the trap. True resilience wouldn't be rebuilding the line faster. It would be engineering a system that doesn't rely on that single vulnerable line at all.
And returning to the financial mechanics we discussed earlier, the capital required to perpetually rebuild that same fallen power pole. It doesn't materialize out of thin air.
The consumers pay for it.
Yep. The storm recovery is financed over time through customer bills.
So you are paying a premium to maintain your own vulnerability. The source phrases it sharply. The question isn't whether the country can survive a disruption, it's whether it can afford repeated ones.
Exactly. Older infrastructure requires more fuel to run. That fuel is imported at volatile global prices, and every time the wind blows a little too hard, the consumer foots the bill for the repairs.
It is a mathematically unsustainable loop.
Completely unsustainable.
So if I'm a consumer looking at my ledger and I realize I'm trapped in this loop paying top-tier global prices to finance a fragile, centralized grid, my immediate logical instinct is to unplug. I want to generate my own power. I want to sever the tie to global oil markets and local transmission failures.
And solar energy is the obvious, technologically mature escape route.
Right.
It offers the exact decentralization the country needs to break the cycle. It provides localized independence from grid outages and entirely eliminates the need for imported fuel to power a specific property.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source introduces what it calls the solar paradox.
The solar paradox.
The technology that should be the perfect structural solution is artificially kept out of reach for the vast majority of households.
The paradox lies in the unit economics. The article points out that solar systems are significantly more expensive locally in Jamaica than they are in larger developed markets.
Which is strange because globally, the price of solar technology has plummeted over the last decade.
Oh, massively. The panels themselves are highly accessible commodities now.
But the journey of a single solar panel from a global manufacturer to a roof in Kingston is an absolute gauntlet of friction and fees. To understand the mechanics of this, it's like being trapped on a sinking ship, seeing a stack of life rafts right there on the deck, but you aren't allowed to use one unless you pay a 500% luxury tax on it first.
That is a brutally accurate analogy.
It's just what?
The individual consumer in Jamaica is forced to navigate commercial-grade barriers. They're paying compounding import duties. They have to manage the bureaucracy and holding fees of clearing equipment through the wharf.
The wharf fees alone.
Right. Then they're subjected to massive markup chains from local distributors who monopolize the limited supply, followed finally by high installation fees.
So by the time that panel is actually converting sunlight into electricity, the capital expenditure is multiples of what it should be.
Exactly. The solution is physically staring them in the face. The sun is shining right on their roof, but the system has structurally priced them out of capturing it.
And the source points out that the failure here is not a failure of the free market, right?
No, not at all. Or a failure of solar technology. It is a profound failure of national policy. The government and the regulatory structures have not aligned their procurement strategies or tax incentives to clear the path for the consumer.
They've allowed the bureaucratic friction to remain higher than the technological benefit.
Exactly. And the source delivers a very pointed critique on this exact dynamic. I'll quote it. The question is no longer whether Jamaica can afford solar, but whether it can afford not to.
Wow. Whether it can afford not to. Because the nation is hemorrhaging capital to import foreign oil specifically to run an aging grid that repeatedly fails.
While the abundant free energy of the sun remains locked behind import duties and distribution markups, it is an extraordinary misallocation of resources.
But how does a government actually fix that? I mean, they can't just wave a wand and change global shipping rates or force local installers to work for free. What does the blueprint for unblocking this exit actually look like in practice?
Well, the actionable solutions require shifting the economic burden from the individual back to the state, primarily through bulk procurement.
Bulk procurement, okay.
The article suggests government-led intervention to negotiate and purchase solar equipment at a massive scale.
So, acting as the grocery store, buying the whole truckload of apples rather than forcing the citizen to buy the single apple and pay for the shipping truck.
Precisely. By utilizing sovereign purchasing power, the government can bypass the fragmented retail markup chain entirely, slashing the baseline cost of the hardware.
That makes a lot of sense.
Following that, the government must restructure the tax code. Current import duties on renewable technology act as a penalty for upgrading national infrastructure.
Which is counterproductive.
Highly counterproductive. Those barriers need to be dismantled to actively incentivize adoption.
Okay, but even if you drastically lower the hardware costs and remove the taxes, handing over a lump sum for a full solar array is still a massive capital expenditure for an average household.
True. Which is why the final pillar of the blueprint is the creation of household financing models.
Oh, okay.
If state-backed or structurally incentivized loans allow households to adopt solar with little to no prohibitive upfront investment.
Like structuring the loan so the monthly repayment is lower than what they were previously paying for grid electricity?
Exactly. Then you unlock mass adoption. The savings literally finance the transition.
And if that transition happens at scale, the macro benefits for the entire country completely alter its economic trajectory.
Completely.
The source maps this out. You dramatically lower the national exposure to global fuel price shocks.
Yep.
You build genuine resilience against hurricanes because a decentralized network of solar homes doesn't care if a transmission line 50 miles away falls down.
Right, it's irrelevant to them.
And you reduce the immense physical and financial pressure on the central grid.
And fundamentally, you return agency to the citizen. You move them from being a passive shock absorber for systemic failure to an active participant in their own energy security.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Whether you're listening to this deep dive in Kingston, London, or New York, how does this structural reality change the way we should view buying a home, valuing property, or even starting a business?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the underlying thesis of the article is that energy independence is no longer a luxury. It is the new foundation of economic independence.
Right.
For generations, the real estate and business sectors treated electricity as a background cost. It was a guaranteed utility, a static line item on a budget spreadsheet.
You built a house, you wired it to the street, and you assumed the grid would do the rest.
But the dynamics we've analyzed today highlight a permanent shift in that assumption. Across Jamaica and in countless regions globally facing severe weather or geopolitical energy crunches, the baseline math of property development is altering.
The source explicitly states energy is no longer a background cost. It is becoming a central factor in value, affordability, and sustainability.
Let's apply that to a real-world scenario. If you build a standard home today that is 100% dependent on a fragile, centralized grid powered by imported fuel, you aren't just building a house.
What are you building?
You are building a massive financial liability into the core of that property. You are permanently pricing in future vulnerability.
Oh, wow. I see what you mean.
A mortgage officer or a property valuer looking at that home has to factor in the reality that whoever lives there will be at the absolute mercy of pass-through costs, volatile oil markets, and post-hurricane recovery fees.
So the net operating income of that household or that business is fundamentally insecure.
Conversely, if you build or retrofit a property with a decentralized solar capacity and battery storage, you fundamentally alter the risk profile of the asset itself.
Because you insulate the property from global oil shocks.
Right.
And you insulate it from local infrastructure failures.
Exactly. It redefines the metric of a valuable property. Value is no longer just derived from square footage, location, or modern amenities. Value is now heavily weighted toward sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
Yeah. Can this structure continue to function? Can this business continue to operate if the external system fails?
It's a fascinating lens to view national progress through, because historically, transitioning away from the traditional, massive, centralized grid might have been viewed as a sign of institutional weakness, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like an admission that the central government or the utility monopolies simply couldn't keep up with demand.
But the author challenges that outdated perspective directly. They write, yes, it would also reduce reliance on the traditional electricity model, but that is not a weakness. It is a transition. Any system designed for long-term national interest must evolve when conditions change.
Evolve when conditions change. The article frames this entire scenario not just as an infrastructure debate, but as a defining question of national direction.
It really is.
A country has to decide if it is going to continuously force consumers to absorb the risk of a legacy model or deliberately architect a distributed, resilient system.
Because the consequences of maintaining the status quo are severe. As the piece concludes, the cost of electricity is no longer just measured in local currency.
Yeah.
It is measured in consumer confidence, economic stability, and the ultimate trajectory of the nation.
Right. If the cost of living in the dark, both literally during prolonged power outages and figuratively in terms of opaque pass-through financial models, becomes too high.
It begins to dictate where people choose to invest, where they choose to live, and whether local businesses can even survive the overhead.
It is a profound wake-up call. We started this deep dive talking about that visceral sinking feeling of opening a utility bill. And by unpacking this Substack article by Dean Jones, we've seen how a seemingly simple 7% bump unspools into a massive geopolitical and structural story.
We really have.
We explored the mechanical trap of the pass-through model, where the consumer is forced to carry all the risk of a volatile world. We analyzed the illusion of resilience in a centralized grid that continually requires the public to finance its own fragility.
And we broke down the supply chain bottlenecks of the solar paradox.
Right. And finally, we looked at the structural blueprint required to turn energy independence into the ultimate measure of property value and national stability.
It requires a complete paradigm shift in how we think about modern development.
Yeah.
We've spent the better part of the last century defining a developed nation by the sheer size, reach, and capacity of its massive centralized power plants.
Absolutely.
The underlying assumption was always, the bigger the grid, the more advanced the country. But looking at the deep vulnerabilities exposed here, the absolute fragility of those long transmission lines, and the brutal economic toll that pass-through costs inflict on everyday citizens, it leaves you wondering.
Wondering what?
What is, in the 21st century, true infrastructure superiority isn't about building a bigger grid to connect everyone, but about empowering every single home to act as its own sovereign power station. If a house can power itself, who actually holds the power?
Wow. Suddenly, the power isn't concentrated in the hands of a distant utility monopoly socializing their risks. The power is decentralized, sitting right there on your roof, entirely within your control.
Exactly.
The next time you walk through the door and see that utility envelope sitting on the counter, you might look at it through a very different lens. You aren't just looking at a bill for services rendered, you are looking at the receipt for a structural choice. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into today's source material. Staying well-informed is truly the best way to navigate these hidden systemic currents. Until next time.